Greetings, YouTube. Good to talk to you today. Today is the 23rd day of September. We are officially in fall. Yesterday, September 22nd, was the autumnal equinox. Equal amount of light and day. So now it starts getting darker, but that is the start of fall. It's also, for you Tolkien individuals out there, was the birthday of Bilbo Baggins and Frodo Baggins. So it was a day to meet around the party tree. It seems like the weather has known that today is the 23rd, because on this first day of fall, or I guess the second day of fall, we woke up here in Western Michigan to about 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Great sleeping weather, but wet, very cold rain. So I was out getting something to eat today, and I noticed all the leaves are starting to change. We're probably at maybe, I don't know, 5-10%. Just starting. Anyways, as I promised a while back, I wanted to give you a story, some background on a story that we find in the book of Acts. It's about Paul going to Athens. In Acts chapter 17, Paul, after going to the Bereans and those at Thessalonica, finds himself in Athens, and tells us a little bit about this particular city. In Acts 17, verse 16 to 21, he says that Athens was a place where they worshiped many gods, and that was true in the Greco-Roman world. As you would walk down the streets, you would find temples and altars and all sorts of gods and goddesses that people would worship at this particular time. Verse 19 talks about how they valued knowledge, and then 20 says that they were interested in all the latest ideas. I think that's very similar to us today in some sense. People are always interested in the latest idea, the newest truth, the newest trend, fashion. I tend to go backwards. I want to know, what is the oldest trend? What is the oldest fashion? And that probably is expressed in how I dress, flannels and things of this nature, but they're comfortable. Anyways, in the midst of this encounter, Paul finds himself at what's called Mars Hill, also called the Hill of Ares. Now, Mars and Ares are two different names for the same god. One is the Greek name, and the other is the Roman name. And Mars Hill is a place where the city court would meet, and people would come together. And this is a place where they had different altars, but it was also called the marketplace, or the agora. And as Paul is there, we read about how he encounters, and as he's talking to the leadership there, as you go on in chapter 17, he says, I notice that you're very religious. He says, and you have all sorts of altars to various gods. He says, I even noticed that you have an altar, ironically or fascinatingly, to the unknown God. So the Athens had not only tried to worship every god they could think of, or they could find, or they knew of, they even had a fallback to say, we'll give an altar to the God we don't even know, whoever that may be. Paul says, I'm going to tell you who that God is. And he begins to give some verses in a kind of a short sermon, in which actually he addresses or answers the 5 great questions of life: origin, meaning, condition, salvation, and destiny. Origin, where everything come from. Meaning, why are we here? Why am I here? Condition, why is the world in the situation that it's in, or why am I the way that I am? salvation, how do we change that? And then destiny, where's everything going? And in the few verses that lead down, I think to about verse 40 or so, Paul answers those 5 questions. The story, however, that I want to tell you about is actually finds its background in the altar to the unknown God that Paul relates. Because when Paul is writing here, Paul is going to describe that particular God. He says, let me tell you who that is. And they had a history with that particular altar. Now, to understand that, we have to go back about 500 years. Now, around 3000 BC, even beyond way beyond the 500, Athens was actually founded. It was an ancient city, became a leading city of Greece around 1200. And by 500 BC, about 500 years before Paul comes here, 560 or so, Athens had reached its height. It was a powerful and cultural city. I mean, this is the location where democracy was founded. Many of the things that we do in the United States, as far as our political system, is founded on the Greek ideals. It was a center of philosophical thought. This is where you find Socrates and Plato, his greatest student. And it was a city of learning. You kind of think of it as a university city today. But around 500, the 5th century there, actually in 431, all that it had achieved was kind of came to a halt. Because in 431, they were attacked by the Spartans, who lived just southwest of where Athens is located. And this became what is known as the Peloponnesian Wars. I think it's southwest. I'm trying to think in my head which direction it is. It's not far, but they were attacked by the Spartans. And we know the Spartans. If you've ever seen the movie 300, you hear about Leonidas and his 300 men, how they staved off Xerxes, who was the Persian leader around 480 or so. And they come over and they thwart the advances of this huge army. And the 300 in the gap of what is known as Thermopylae, or the Hot Gates, they stop them there, and Xerxes comes back a defeated king. Well, the Spartans attacked Athens at 431, and this was the Peloponnesian War. While they were attacked, of course, it was a walled city, but when they were attacked, and these are philosophers, and the Spartans is definitely an army-based type of nation, the Athenians found themselves just trapped in their city, and they have all these Spartans outside. And what are you going to do? Seems to be a hopeless situation. The problem was that wasn't the only problem they had. All of a sudden, they had a plague that developed inside the city. So you're surrounded by Spartans in this walled city, and now there's a plague that breaks out. There was a Greek historian named Thucydides. And I love the names of the people that lived this time. They had great names. Thucydides. We'll talk about another one, Epimenides. They had some pretty cool sounding names. Anyways, he was actually an eyewitness of this and wrote about it, and you can find his writings today. But he talked about how it absolutely just was devastating the city of Athens. I mean, they're trying to hold on against the Spartans, and now they have this plague. And it was believed that it killed up to at least 25% of the population. 1 in 4 people died from this. In fact, it was so bad that they had to take the bodies and they had to burn them, kind of a funeral pyres, and they would light these bodies on fire to get rid of to keep the plague from spreading. Well, the Spartans figured out what was going on. And in fact, the plague was so bad from their perspective that the Spartans actually said, we don't want anything to do with the plague. They actually left. Now that helped out a little bit for the Athenians. Now they could get out of the city, but they still had the plague that was going on, and it had now was spreading among the people and to the area. The leadership got together and they said, we need to find someone who can help us solve this plague. They had sacrificed to every god that they knew, and nothing seemed to work. So they came together and they said, there is a man called Epimenides. He was a philosopher, a sage of this time. He lived on the island of Crete. And they said, let's see if he will come here and help us. Now, a philosopher at that time is not a person like you find today. Philosopher would be more of what we would call they would think about the world in grand visions and try to understand the world as philosophy does today. But they were also kind of the leading scientists in a sense, and mathematicians. I mean, they were the sages of the intellect of that time. So they sent an envoy, Epimenides, told him the situation. And he said, yes. He said, I'll come and I'll help. Well, he comes and they bring him to Mars Hill. He views everything that's going on, and he gets to the marketplace where all the decisions are made. And he looks at the council and he says, I tell you what to do. He said, tomorrow morning, he said, I want you to meet me here. First thing, first light, I want you to bring 2 flocks of sheep. Make sure that they have been in a pen. Make sure they have not eaten whenever you bring them here in the morning. And he said, and bring stone masons and some stones. Now, this intrigued the people that were listening, and word got out that Epimenides had asked for something that seems a little odd. People didn't know what was going to go on or how he was going to solve this with 2 flocks of sheep and some masons and some stones. The next morning, a lot of people showed up just to kind of see what the philosopher would do. And he said, it's obvious that you've sacrificed to all these different gods. He said, but obviously that's not working. That's not helping. He says, but I would have to think there must be some God that knows you, but you don't know him. He says, so what I want you to do is I want you to take the sheep, I want you to let them loose over what was Mars Hill at that time, probably called something different in 430 AD. But he says, I want you to let them roam. He says, and anywhere a sheep sits down or lays down without eating first, I want you to mark the spot, take a mason and take the stones and build an altar and sacrifice that sheep on that spot. Of course, the people kind of laughed because they said, well, everyone knows that sheep in the morning will eat, and whenever they're filled, then they'll lay down. They don't lay down before they fill their stomach. But according to history and the records there, to their surprise, they said that there were some sheep that actually laid down without eating. And they did what Epimenides told them to do. They built an altar, sacrificed the sheep. And he said, make sure that you write the inscription to the unknown God, because we don't know who he is. To the surprise of the people also, within just 24 hours, they began to see relief from the plague. And within a week, it was all but gone. It was many years later, it's recorded, that 2 of the kids that were viewing this, at that time, they were kids, but about 60 years later, they were walking, and they now were leaders in Athens. They happened to walk by Mars Hill, and they saw the remnants of what were those whitewashed altars to the unknown God. Now, most of these, they said, that were in disrepair. They said, we remember what happened that day, how this unknown God saved us from a plague. And they determined that they would remove all the different altars except for one. They would rebuild it. They would whitewash it, set it up nice, and it would become a memorial for the people of Athens. Always remember that there was a God out there somewhere who had helped them in that time of need. Now that, from there, you fast forward into the 1st century when Paul is in Athens, probably 52 to 56 AD. And Paul enters Athens, and as he enters it, he sees this very tomb that was dedicated to the unknown God. Paul says, this is the God that I'm going to describe to you. Paul is using the history of this, the people of Athens, to communicate the God of Christianity. And I find it interesting how he uses history in many different ways, but this is one of the most amazing connections that he makes to an event that happened almost 600 years earlier. And you see that Paul is making this connection. I mean, some would say, well, he just saw it and he said, here's an opportunity. But we can see that Paul is making it because in the midst of answering those 5 great questions and describing who this God is, he says, he makes a quote. He says, for in him, this is speaking of the God of Christianity that Paul is trying to convey to them. He says, for in him we live and move and have our being. And Paul says, as some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Now, the quote alone doesn't really connect us back to what happened in the plague, but when we find out who made the quote, it does. Because the person who wrote that, the philosopher that Paul quotes, is Epimenides, who was the very person who helped them solve the problem by dedicating an altar to the unknown God. So, just another quick example of some of the background that when you look at what the Bible is talking about, there's so much history behind it. Anyway, I've been studying through or actually teaching through the book of Esther, and there's a lot of connection there with Xerxes because it's all about Esther and Xerxes, or his title was also Ahasuerus, and he was the Persian king at the height of its empire that went and attacked Greece earlier, just before this time. But we'll save that background and story for another time. So anyways, I hope you have a blessed day. Hope it's not too cold where you are, but enjoy the fall, enjoy the colors that are coming, all the festivals and the season, everything that autumn brings to us. It's just an absolutely wonderful time of the year. And enjoy some cider. I got some hot apple cider, favorite drink at this particular time. So here's to you and your family, and I hope things go well for you.